Hello. The Divine Code reading for December 2nd, pages 355 and 356. We are in the chapter, The Prohibition Against Mating Different Species of Animals. Topic number 7. When the same species has a domesticated subspecies and a wild subspecies, an ox and a wild ox, or a horse and a wild horse. Mishnah, Rishana, Tractate Klim, Chapter 8. One may mate them together because they are the same species. Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, Rambam, the Laws of Forbidden Mixtures, Chapter 8, and Shulchan Aruch Yeridea, Chapter 297. Some wild dogs are permitted for mating with domesticated dogs as they are the same species. Jerusalem Talmud, Tractate Klim, Chapter 1. So there's cases where animals they're either taken from the wild and they're domesticated. And then they're bred in a domesticated situation while they're still related to what they originally came out of in the wild. And that would be all the horses and the dogs, for example, were at one point wild, then they're brought in. Now, in the case of domesticated animals or domesticated dogs, they're no longer related to what was their 500th cousin because it's been so long, and it's not really possible to say that these dogs came from the ones in the wild. However, a certain percentage of dogs kind of return to the wild for whatever reason, and they are related. The ones that have kind of gone back to the wild are still related to the ones that are domesticated. In the case of horses, for such a long period of time in Asia, particularly, the horses were captured and domesticated. And then in the case of North America and possibly other places, they were domesticated, but then they became wild. They were set free, however that happened, and they became wild. Like in the American West, there are wild herds of animals. There are horses that just run wild. Those are related to the domesticated horses. So it's possible to re-domesticate those animals and rebreed them with the domesticated horses because they're basically the same animal. And that's where it gets a little tricky, because there are cases where there's wild dogs that are not considered related to the same species as the domesticated dogs. So it gets very tricky, and that's where it has to be studied out in order to know the differences. Topic number 8. There's a difference of opinion as to whether domestic goats and wild goats are the same species in this context of permission to cause them to mate. Maggid, Mishnah, Hilkot, Maholot, Asurit, Chapter 1, regarding the opinion of Rambam. The rule that is followed is that it is forbidden to mate them together. See Rashba, Tor Yeridea, Chapter 80, and Miri on Tractate Kulin 80. So domesticated and wild goats, they probably go back to a common species millennia ago, and there's a difference of opinion where it gets tricky. But if it's done, it's not considered a major concern. Topic number 9. A buffalo or bison is a wild animal that is not the same species as a domesticated ox. Hence, the two may not be mated. Although it appears from Tractate Colon 80 that the buffalo and wild ox are of the same species, Radvaz and Laws of Forbidden Mixtures, Chapter 9, and Samexetic in his Novella on Talmud, Tractate Klim, clearly rule against this based on the understanding of Tosafot Klim, or Tosefta Klim, Chapter 1, Rambam, Laws of Forbidden Foods, Chapter 1, and Shulchan Aruch, Yoredea, Chapter 80. And here I assume that all these are talking about European or Old World bison, or wouldn't, yeah, I would assume that even more so, whatever it is, even more so, the American bison would be separated from the ox. These things have been studied out. They need to be reintroduced. The study needs to be reintroduced specifically for this to understand this purpose, for the sake of the no hide commandments. It's an area that will have to be studied out for those no hides that are involved in breeding animals. This is going to have to be an area that will be studied out. Topic number 10. Although a chicken, a peacock, and a pheasant have similarities and graze together, they are considered a different species and may not be cross-mated. See Rashi on Tractate Bava Kama 55 and also Bava Kama 55. Similarly, a domestic duck and a wild duck are different species. This is evidenced by the fact that the testicles of a domestic duck are located within the body, and those of a wild duck are outside. Hence, they are two different types, and they cannot be cross-mated. Rambam on the Laws of Forbidden Mixtures, Chapter 9, and Shulchan Aruch Yoredea, Chapter 297. Topic number 11. If one transgressed and cross-mated animals from two different species, it is permitted to consume the offspring and benefit from them in other ways, and to sustain them and raise them to maturity. Mishnah and Tractate Klim, Chapter 8, Rambam and Shulchan Aruch. I would assume Chapter 297. If two crossbred offspring are born from the same type of parents, the parents being similar pair of different species, it is permitted to mate these offspring together. For example, it is permitted to mate two mules together if each was born of a female donkey and a male horse. And this is also, the donkeys are mentioned in the later, the donkey example is mentioned in the next topic. And in the example of the donkeys is that if the both of the hybrids, I guess in the example of mules, if both of the hybrid mules are from female the females are the same species, then they can be crossed, and then they can be bred. But if it's a male, if one mother is one species and the other mother is of another species, and they cannot be mated, is the way it's explained here. And that's gone into more at the end of today's reading. Topic number 12. A hybrid offspring is considered a separate species, and it's forbidden to be mated for the animal from which the species of either of the parents. So the hybrid, like in the case of the mule, cannot be bred with either a horse or a donkey, because the mule is a different species now. And the fact that the mules are normally understood to be sterile is irrelevant to what's being discussed here, because the prohibition against mating different species, the mating does not necessarily imply being able to bear offspring. It can be animals that could not. We've already learned from yesterday's reading, it's animals that could not, even if they cannot bear offspring, the joining together of their genitalia is what's considered mating. So that's what's being prohibited here concerning two mules. Moreover, a hybrid mother from the hybrid whose mother is from one species cannot be mated with a hybrid whose mother is from the other species. Two hybrids whose mother is of the same species may, however, be mated together. For example, a mule is the offspring produced when crossbreeding a horse and a donkey. So the fact that the mule is a product of the crossbreeding is not relevant to the condition of a mule, except to know who the mother and the father are. But we put aside the fact that in of itself was a prohibition. Now we're just looking at the status of the mule. When the mother of one mule is a horse and the mother of another mule is a donkey, the two offspring may not be mated. Needless to say, the offspring may not be mated with the species of its mother or father. And when it says needless to say, that doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be said. It probably does need to be said, but it means that it's just assumed. It's something we assume to be true. It's already been stated at the beginning of. It was already stated in the paragraph before, so obviously it does need to be said. But it's a figure of speech to say needless to be said. Needless to say, the offspring may not be mated with the species of its mother or father. One may, however, mate together two mules whose mothers are horses, or two mules whose mothers are donkeys. And when they say mated together, again, with yesterday's reading, it's where they're physically being brought together. A person is pushing the animals together. It's not that they're being like left alone in a corral together. It's even though that might also be a concern, a prohibited concern, but it's not. What's referred to here is when they're physically being forced on each other, which I guess was the ancient method of producing livestock. Torah law sources explain that if one wishes to mate two mules but does not know which species is their mother's, the mules can can be checked for similarities by comparing their ears, tails, and voices. Rambam in Shulchan Aruch, chapter 297, it appears that the sages knew the identifying signs for mules with the same species of mothers. So this is a area of livestock training that's been kind of lost over time. The ability to distinguish who the mother was, if it's not known. If you have a mule, obviously the mule had a mother and a father. So how do you tell how do you tell the lineage of the mule, to distinguish one whose mother is a horse versus the one whose mother is a donkey, is by looking at some characteristics. The ears, tails, and voices apparently have some distinguishing characteristics to it, which we're not sure what those are today, but the ancient people could tell, and that's how they would check. This is not something that would normally come up in real life, because who's going to try to mate two mules when mules don't produce offspring? But it does have there is a reason to figure it out, and there's a reason to be cautious in this area. Now, concerning all these different animals, there are definitely Torah sources for knowing which animals or species, which animal. Right? By Torah, I mean the sages over time have put out this material. It's not something that's usually out in the open in the Torah books because it's not relevant. I mean, the whole question of who's mating wild dogs with domesticated dogs, it didn't happen, and so there was no need for it to be written down in a clearly understandable book. The knowledge was there if need be. Today, people are doing these things, and it's talked more in the beginning of tomorrow's reading. There is a certain amount of this that goes on. Somebody wants really strong dogs for some reason, and the breeders are looking at wild subspecies, and it's necessary for Noahides to know which ones are which. There have been some books that have been printed. Here is a book on birds, and it's primarily for the purpose of the mitzvah of shooing away the mother bird, but it also goes into which species are kosher and which species are not, and what areas where they're not sure about. It goes into some detail of that. We're going to need, for Noahide dog breeders and livestock, to be able to know what animals which. So there's going to have to be, eventually there'll have to be something that will be able to explain that concerning livestock, and a book of that nature needs to be produced, because in order to for the people that need to know this information, it needs to be available. Thank you.